Listen to part of a lecture in a poetry class. The professor is discussing medieval poetry.
Okay, so the two poems we're looking at today fall into the category of medieval times, which was how long ago?
Almost 1,000 years ago, right?
Yes, that's right.
But, Professor, are you sure these are poems? I mean, I thought poems were shorter. These are more like long stories. I mean, one of them was all about love, but the other one, the whatever it's called, the other one, well, it was all about fighting and battles. I mean, can both of them be considered poems?
Well, think back to the very beginning of this course.
Uh-huh.
Remember how we define poetry? In the very broadest sense, we said it's written to evoke, to make you, the audience, have some kind of emotional experience through the use of imagery, some kind of predictable rhythm, and usually, but not always, there's more than one meaning implied with the words that are used. Let's start with chanson poetry first. That's chanson. Chanson poems became popular in Europe, particularly in France, and the term is actually short for a longer French phrase that translates to songs of deeds. Now, they were called songs of deeds because, strangely enough, they were written to describe the heroic deeds or actions of warriors, the knights during conflicts. We don't know a lot about the authors. It's still contested somewhat, but we're pretty sure about who the chanson poems were written for. That is, they were written for knights and the lords, the nobility that they served. The poems were sung, performed by a minstrel, a singer who traveled from castle to castle, singing to the local lord and his knights. Would someone summarize the main features of the chanson poem you read?
Well, there's a hero, a knight, who goes to battle, and he's admired for his courage, bravery, and loyalty to the lord he serves, his country, and his fellow warriors in the field. He's a skilled fighter, willing to face the most extreme dangers, sacrificial, willing to sacrifice anything and everything to protect his king and country.
Okay, now, given that the intended audience for these poems were knights and lords, what can we say about the purpose of chanson poetry? What kinds of feelings was it meant to provoke?
I guess they must have been really appealing to those knights and lords who were listening to them. Hearing the songs probably made them feel more patriotic, made them feel like it was a good and noble thing to serve their countries in whatever way they could.
Good. We've got a pretty good picture of what the chanson hero was like. Now, let's compare that to the hero in the other poem. The other poem is an example of what's called romance poetry. And the hero in the romance poem was also a knight. But what made the knight in romance poetry different from the knight in chanson poetry? Well, first, the purpose of the hero's actions was different. The hero in romance poetry is independent, purely solitary in a way, not like the chanson poet, who was always surrounded by his fighting companions. He doesn't engage in conflict to protect his lord or country. He does it for the sake of adventure, to improve himself, to show he's worthy of respect and love from his lady. He's very conscious of the particular rules of social behavior he has to live up to somehow, and all of his actions are for the purpose of proving that he is an upright, moral, well-mannered, well-behaved individual. You may have noticed that in chanson poetry, there isn't much about the hero's feelings. The focus is on the actions, the deeds. But the romance poetry describes a lot of the inner feelings, the motivations, psychology, you could say, of a knight trying to improve himself, to better himself so that he's worthy of the love of a woman. What explains this difference? Well, digging into the historical context tells us a lot. Romance poetry emerged a few generations after chanson, and its roots were in geographic regions of France that were calmer, where conflict wasn't central to people's lives. More peaceful times meant there was more time for education, travel, more time for reflection. Another name for romance poetry that's often synonymous with it is troubadour poetry. Troubadours were the authors of these new romance poems, and we know a lot more about the troubadours than we do about the chanson authors, because they often had small biographical sketches added to their poems that gave pretty specific information about their social status, geographical location, and a small outline of their career. This information wasn't particularly reliable because they were sometimes based on fictitious stories of great adventure or scrapped together from parts of different poems. But there is enough there to squeeze or infer some facts about their social class. The political climate had settled down enough so that troubadours had the luxury of being able to spend most, if not all of their time, creating, crafting, or composing their love songs for their audiences. And yes, these poems were also sung. Many troubadours were able to make a living being full-time poets, which should tell you something about the value of that profession during medieval times.
What is the main purpose of the talk? Listen to part of a lecture in a creative writing class.
All right, everybody. The topic for today is, well, we're going to take a look at how to start creating the characters for the stories you're writing. One way of doing that is to come up with what's called a character sketch. I don't mean a sketch like a drawing. I guess that's obvious. A sketch is a way of getting started on defining your characters' personalities. To begin, how do we create fictional characters? Well, we don't just pull them from thin air, do we? I mean, we don't create them out of nothing. We base them, consciously or unconsciously, we base them on real people. Or we blend several people's traits, their attributes, into one character. But when people think fiction, they may assume the characters come from the author's imagination. But the writer's imagination is influenced by real people. Could be anyone, so pay attention to the people you meet. Someone in class, at the gym, that guy who's always sitting in the corner at the coffee house, your cousin who's always getting into dangerous situations. We're pulling from reality, gathering bits and pieces of real people. You use these people and the bits of behavior or characteristics as a starting point as you begin to sketch out your characters. Here's what you should think about doing first. When you begin to formulate a story, make a list of interesting people you know or have observed. Consider why they're unique or annoying. Then make notes about their unusual or dominant attributes. As you create fictional characters, you'll almost always combine characteristics from several different people on your list to form the identity and personality of just one character. Keeping this kind of character sketch can help you solidify your character's personality so that it remains consistent throughout your story. You need to define your characters, know their personalities so that you can have them acting in ways that are predictable, consistent with their personalities. Get to know them like a friend. You know your friends well enough to know how they'll act in certain situations, right? Say you have 3 friends. Their car runs out of gas on the highway. John gets upset. Mary remains calm. Teresa takes charge of handling the situation. And let's say both John and Mary defer to her leadership. They call you to explain what happened. And when John tells you he got mad, you're not surprised, because he always gets frustrated when things go wrong. And then he tells you how Teresa took charge, calmed him down, assigned tasks for each person, and got them on their way. Again, you're not surprised. It's exactly what you'd expect. Well, you need to know your characters like you know your friends. If you know a lot about a person's character, it's easy to predict how they'll behave. So, if your characters' personalities are well defined, it'll be easy for you as the writer to portray them realistically, believably, in any given situation. While writing character sketches, do think about details. Ask yourself questions, even if you don't use the details in your story. What does each character like to eat? What setting does each prefer? The mountains, the city. What about educational background? Their reactions to success or defeat? Write it all down. But here, I need to warn you about a possible pitfall. Don't make your character into a stereotype. Remember, the reader needs to know how your character is different from other people who might fall in the same category. Maybe your character loves the mountains and has lived in a remote area for years. To make sure he's not a stereotype, ask yourself how he sees life differently from other people who live in that kind of setting. Be careful not to make him into the cliché of the rugged mountain dweller. Okay, now I'll throw out a little terminology. It's easy stuff. Major characters are sometimes called round characters. Minor characters are sometimes called, well, just the opposite, flat. A round character is fully developed. A flat character isn't. Character development is fairly limited. The flat character tends to serve mainly as a motivating factor. For instance, you introduce a flat character who has experienced some sort of defeat, and then your main character, who loves success and loves to show off, comes and boasts about succeeding, and jokes about the flat character's defeat in front of others, humiliates the other guy. The flat character is introduced solely for the purpose of allowing the round character to show off.
What aspect of creative writing does the Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
Now, we can't really talk about fairy tales without first talking about folk tales, because there's a strong connection between these two genres, these two types of stories. In fact, many fairy tales started out as folk tales. So, what's a folk tale? How would you characterize them? Jeff?
Well, they're old stories, traditional stories. They were passed down orally within cultures from generation to generation, so they changed a lot over time. I mean, every storyteller, or maybe every town, might have had a slightly different version of the same folktale.
That's right. There's local difference, and that's why we say folktales are communal. By communal, we mean they reflect the traits and the concerns of a particular community at a particular time. So essentially, the same tale could be told in different communities, with certain aspects of the tale adapted to fit the specific community. Not the plot. The details of what happens in the story would remain constant. That was the thread that held the tale together. But all the other elements, like the location or characters, might be modified for each audience. Okay, so what about fairy tales? They also are found in most cultures, but how are they different from folk tales? I guess the first question is, what is a fairy tale? And don't anyone say, a story with a fairy in it, because we all know that very few fairy tales actually have those tiny magical creatures in them. But what else can we say about them? Mary?
Well, they seem to be less realistic than folk tales. Like they have something improbable happening. A frog turning into a prince, say. Oh, that's another common element. Royalty, a prince or princess. And fairy tales all seem to take place in a location that's nowhere and everywhere at the same time.
What's the line? How do all those stories start? Once upon a time in a faraway land. Well, in the case of folk tales, each storyteller would specify a particular location and time, though the time and location would differ for different storytellers. With fairy tales, however, the location is generally unspecified, no matter who the storyteller is. That land far away. We'll come back to this point in a few minutes.
I thought a fairy tale was just the written version of an oral folk tale.
Well, not exactly, though that is how many fairy tales developed. For example, in the late 18th century, the Grimm brothers traveled throughout what's now Germany, recording local folk tales. These were eventually published as fairy tales, but not before undergoing a process of evolution. Now, a number of things happen when an oral tale gets written down. First, the language changes. It becomes more formal, more standard. Some might say less colorful. It's like the difference in your language depending on whether you're talking to someone or writing them a letter. Second, when an orally transmitted story is written down, an authoritative version with a recognized author is created. The communal aspect gets lost. The tale no longer belongs to the community. It belongs to the world, so to speak. Because of this, elements like place and time can no longer be tailored to suit a particular audience, so they become less identifiable, more generalizable to any audience. On the other hand, descriptions of characters and settings can be developed more completely. In folk tales, characters might be identified by a name, but you wouldn't know anything more about them. But in fairy tales, people no longer have to remember plots. They're written down, right? So more energy can be put into other elements of the story, like character and setting. So you get more details about the characters, about where the action takes place, what people's houses were like, whether they're small cabins or grand palaces. And it's worth investing that energy because the story, now in book form, isn't in danger of being lost. Those details won't be forgotten. If a folk tale isn't repeated by each generation, it may be lost for all time. But with a fairy tale, it's always there in a book, waiting to be discovered again and again. Another interesting difference involves the change in audience, who the stories are meant for. Contrary to what many people believe today, folk tales were originally intended for adults, not for children. So why is it that fairy tales seem targeted toward children nowadays?
What is the lecture mainly about? Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
All right, so let me close today's class with some thoughts to keep in mind while you're doing tonight's assignment. You'll be reading one of Ralph Waldo Emerson's best-known essays, Self-Reliance, and comparing it with his poems and other works. I think this essay has the potential to be quite meaningful for all of you, as young people who probably wonder about things like truth and where your lives are going, all sorts of profound questions. Knowing something about Emerson's philosophies will help you when you read Self-Reliance. And basically, one of the main beliefs that he had was about truth. Not that it's something that we can be taught. Emerson says it's found within ourselves. So this truth, the idea that it's in each one of us, is one of the first points that you'll see Emerson making in this essay. It's a bit abstract, but he's very into each person believing his or her own thought, believing in yourself, the thought or conviction that's true for you. But actually, he ties that in with a sort of universal truth, something that everyone knows but doesn't realize they know. Most of us aren't in touch with ourselves, in a way, so we just aren't capable of recognizing profound truths. It takes geniuses, people like, say, Shakespeare, who are unique because when they have a glimpse of this truth, this universal truth, they pay attention to it and express it, and don't just dismiss it like most people do. So Emerson is really into each individual believing in and trusting him or herself. You'll see that he writes about, well, first, conformity. He criticizes the people of his time for abandoning their own minds and their own wills for the sake of conformity and consistency. They try to fit in with the rest of the world, even though it's at odds with their beliefs and their identities. Therefore, it's best to be a nonconformist, to do your own thing, not worrying about what other people think. That's an important point. He really drives this argument home throughout the essay. When you're reading, I want you to think about that and why that kind of thought would be relevant to the readers of his time. Remember, this is 1838. Self-reliance was a novel idea at the time, and United States citizens were less secure about themselves as individuals and as Americans. The country as a whole was trying to define itself. Emerson wanted to give people something to really think about, help them find their own way, and what it meant to be who they were. So that's something that I think is definitely as relevant today as it was then, probably, especially among young adults like yourselves. You know, college being a time to sort of really think about who you are and where you're going. Now, we already said that Emerson really emphasized nonconformity, right? As a way to sort of not lose your own self and identity in the world, to have your own truth and not be afraid to listen to it. Well, he takes it a step further. Not conforming also means not conforming with yourself or your past. What does that mean? Well, if you've always been a certain way or done a certain thing, but it's not working for you anymore, or you're not content, Emerson says that it would be foolish to be consistent even with our own past. Focus on the future, he says. That's what matters more. Inconsistency is good. He talks about a ship's voyage, and this is one of the most famous bits of the essay, how the best voyage is made up of zigzag lines. Up close, it seems a little all over the place, but from farther away the true path shows, and in the end it justifies all the turns along the way. So don't worry if you're not sure where you're headed or what your long-term goals are. Stay true to yourself and it'll make sense in the end. I mean, I can attest to that. Before I was a literature professor, I was an accountant. Before that, I was a newspaper reporter. My life has taken some pretty interesting turns, and here I am, very happy with my experiences and where they've brought me. If you rely on yourself and trust your own talents, your own interests, don't worry. Your path will make sense in the end.
What is the main purpose of the